So Callum Smith v David Morrell has finally been confirmed for April 14th in the M&S Bank Arena in Liverpool for Callum Smith's WBO interim light heavyweight world championship. Now, Callum Smith's a guy who, of course, was an undefeated two-belt world champion at super middleweight, and of course has moved up to light heavyweight now and is campaigning there. David Morrell was a guy who's similarly started his career at super middleweight, never won a world title at super middleweight, but moved up to light heavyweight and is, making his way towards hopefully fighting for a world championship one day. He has lost before. His only loss was to David Benavidez at 175 pounds. Of course, David Benavidez, one of the top names in the sport of boxing at any weight class. And then he had a comeback fight against Imam Kataev in a fight where arguably Imam Kataev should have won that fight, but David Morrell done enough to get the decision victory, and he now moves on to fight Callum Smith. Now, this is a video that I wanted to make a couple of times and did make a couple of times actually, because there was a ton of sort of uncertainty around this fight, particularly around the purse bids, where the purse bids were happening, then they weren't, then they were getting delayed, then they couldn't get agreed, and then it got agreed, and then we're waiting for a date, and then now we are in a situation where finally a date has been confirmed for this, a date and venue has been confirmed for this fight, and we know it's definitely taking place. Of course, Callum Smith is coming off a huge win over Joshua Buatsi, giving Joshua Buatsi his first loss. And Callum Smith's wanted to go on to bigger and better things. He wants to fight for a world championship again. If he, and whichever route he has to take here, he'll take that route. Of course, if he's the current WBO interim world champion, then the logical next step would be if he was to beat David Morrell, he becomes the mandatory for Dimitri Bivol. But Dimitri Bivol's in an interesting spot where he's not really shown interest in fighting any of the top names, right? He's not interested in a Beterbiev rematch. Hasn't seemed interested in a David Benavidez fight. David Benavidez's next fight is going to be at cruiserweight. The only other names in the division really is like Callum Smith, really. Unless you get someone move up from super middleweight, like a Hamza Shiraz or something. But again, Hamza Shiraz isn't a world champion at super middleweight even. So yeah, we will definitely see. Happy to see this fight's getting made. I do think Callum Smith is probably the better boxer out of the two of them, even though I actually do rate David Morrell, and I think he's a good boxer. He's a slick boxer. He's definitely the type of guy that can give you problems, and against David Benavidez did have some success against David Benavidez, undoubtedly was able to cause him some problems, and it was only until the back end of the fight, once David Benavidez has worked out Morrell and was able to apply his physicality more, it was when he was really able to sort of show that gap in class. But Callum Smith isn't necessarily going to have that physical advantage that David Benavidez has over pretty much everyone. But Callum Smith, what he does have is a great jab, very disciplined, very measured, an experienced boxer who's been in there with tons of world level guys at this point. Was in there with Canelo, done 12 rounds. I believe he's done 12 rounds. I don't think he got stopped by Canelo, but been in there with Canelo. Of course, was a world champion at super middleweight, undefeated two-belt world champion at super middleweight actually. So a very accomplished boxer. David Morrell is no scrub as well. Not beating anyone on the level of Callum Smith before, but he has been in there with guys the level of Callum Smith. The likes of David Benavidez is on the level of a Callum Smith. He did lose against David Benavidez, and of course, Imam Kataev is probably just a touch below, but right on the cusp of reaching that next level as well, and arguably could have beaten David Morrell in that fight. But I do think Callum Smith is going to be favoured in this fight, and rightfully so. He's, in his hometown, it's him defending, he's the reigning interim champion. I do think he's got enough in the tank to beat David Morrell, even at this point in Callum Smith's career, where, he's been through a lot at this point in his career. Been through a lot of training camps, been through a lot of 12-round fights, been through a lot of wars, a lot of miles on the clock. I still think he's got enough in the tank to beat a David Morrell. Be super curious to know what you guys think in the comments below. Another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest in the bag, and I'm out. Peace.